José Esteban Muñoz. He was a Cuban-American academic who wrote in the fields of performance studies, queer theory, visual culture, cultural studies, and critical theory. I read most of this book, Cruising Utopia, for this project, which continues to be the sex eggs. He was originally born in Havana in 1967, with his family moving to Florida soon after he was born. He went to Sarah Lawrence for undergrad and Duke for his graduate degree in literature, blah, 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 accolades. He was wicked smart, and tragically, he died suddenly in 2013 of heart failure. Muñoz wrote in a number of different magazines and scholarly articles in performance studies. Performance by its nature is ephemeral and momentary, is a founding facet of performance studies, and Muñoz wrote about what he called traces that were left behind by the gestures and ephemeral nature of performance. His first book is called Disidentifications, Queers of Color and the Performance of Politics. Muñoz writes on his theory of disidentification, which to be like super basic, is about the strategies minority members of society who don't fit within white heteronormativity use to survive erasure by the dominant majority. Instead of rejecting or assimilating, Muñoz thinks that they instead disidentify, working, to quote, working on, with, and against the cultural form. So the big idea that I've been reading about in Cruising Utopia, his second book, is that queerness does not exist in the present or shouldn't be thought to exist in the present. Instead, queerness exists in this imagined future, in this utopia in the future that's to be striven for. It's not a thing that exists now. Quote, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. End quote. Queerness is not a fixed, static thing. Muñoz thinks queerness is an ever-moving goalpost, an infinitely extending horizon. Muñoz, in fact, believes that queerness has value only as a thing that exists in the future, a thing to be striven for. An example of this is the manifesto of a group published in 1971. The group was called Third World Gay Revolution, and it was titled What We Want, What We Believe. There's a bunch of stuff that they say, but the part that's interesting is this. We want a new society, a revolutionary socialist society. We want liberation of humanity, free food, free shelter, free clothing, free transportation, free healthcare, free utilities, free education, free art for all. We believe that all people should share the labor and products of society according to each one's needs and abilities, regardless of race, sex, age, or sexual preferences. That's the utopian thinking that Muñoz criticized modern queer movements for lacking. The push for marriage equality, for instance, Muñoz thought it was anemic. Marriage equality is essentially a push for integration, normalization, which is a pragmatic move above all. Marriage affords huge benefits to couples, so long as they have the capital necessary to capitalize on those benefits. The failing with that, according to Muñoz, is that it's not pushing far enough. It's ignoring the inspirational and aspirational aspects of queerness, that utopian future where social and political forces, whatever you want, are reorganized and reimagined. The utopia provides a mechanism for processing the present rather than being an end state, finite, finished. So the last kind of big idea, which I already touched on a little bit, is this idea of the trace that's left behind from performance. Muñoz thinks that there is a trace. The connection between that trace and queerness and performance is mulled over quite a bit by Muñoz. Queer people, by and large, don't reproduce biologically, so they propagate not by biological means, but instead the more ephemeral of gesture, of performance. Books like the one Muñoz has wrote, that's a kind of trace left behind. Quote, anti-relational thesis moves to imagine an escape of relationality as a distancing of queerness from the contamination of race, gender, or other particularities. This quote made me kind of reconsider my approach to the egg as it relates to this idea of anti-relational queerness. The egg is a distillation of an abstract, and so by its nature ignores specifics or any kind of intersectionality. I'm still kind of thinking about how or even whether I will attempt to address that. Quote, Radical negativity, like the negation of negation, offers us a mode of understanding negativity that is starkly different from the version of negative proposed by the queer anti-relationist. Here, the negative becomes the resource for a certain mode of queer utopianism. This shifted my thinking on the eggs from being expressly a thing to be destroyed to a thing for radical negation, for active critique or discourse or idealism, or more pointedly, hope. Quote, "The field of utopian possibility is one in which multiple forms of belonging and difference adhere to a belonging in collectivity." In regards to the third world gay revolution I mentioned before, Munoz says that the we they are talking about, that is wanting and believing stuff, that's a collective that contains within itself differences and more so affords space for those differences. This got me thinking in an abstract way about the space contained within the egg and what breaking it or cherishing it, how that affects that space within. Quote, "I respond to the assertion that the future is the province of the child and therefore not for the queers by arguing that queerness is primarily about futurity and hope." Munoz is criticizing other writers who argue for this like punk rock anti-relational queer theory. No kids equals no future equals a focus on the present exclusively. Do for yourself now. I'm thinking that this egg is kind of like a kid that I'm creating, where maybe I'm trying to like hatch a utopia. This one threw me for a loop. It's a quote within a quote of the book. The quote is of Theodore W. Adorno on the utopian function of art, who's referencing Ernst Bloch's statement from the day before, where he was quoting Spinoza, a 16th century Dutch philosopher. Quote, "Falsum index sui et veri," translated, "the false is the sign of itself and the correct." This bit, which is a rat's nest of attributions, really concretized the idea of my eggs. I'm trying to signify the falseness of biologically informed gender binary, sex binary, to point at the truth that it implies. So in making physical that idea, I'm in a sense creating a lie that points to a truth. So this is the first fully fired and completed cast in 360 degrees for your viewing pleasure. Some of y'all had the opportunity to hold it and feel it. That's like really the point for me and is becoming super problematic at this particular point in time with COVID. So in reading Munoz, this idea of the anti-relational, the anti-punk thing is moving me away from my initial thought of just having everyone smash these dudes. The bullseye notwithstanding with this render, maybe the eggs are just there as a kind of like focus, like a worry stone or something to meditate on. Still, I don't want this taken to the far extreme where there are these like idols that are precious and they need to be held in a museum or whatever. I still want these eggs to have that same ephemeral quality that Munoz is talking about with like gesture and performance. I think like the thing that I am making is ultimately that performance or that gesture. Ultimately, I'd like everybody to have the opportunity to judge the sex binary's weight and bearing on their own lives and to get into that utopian mindset Munoz talks about. So much of my interactions with people, especially when we're talking about the present, COVID, possible coup, alt-right violence, police riots, it feels hopeless. That future utopianism imagined creates avenues forward. There's merit to knowledge of the present, to be cautious and wary, of course, but there should also be the space for hope. So the biggest takeaway for me from what I've gotten through of Cruising Utopia is the usefulness of the utopia as a tool for critiquing the present. Even removed from the structure of queerness, that utopian thought is a really is just inspiring thought process to engage with. Instead of just saying the world's shit and listing off the shit, I or we or you even can think of a future that isn't shit and work backwards towards the present. It gives the tool, for me at least, to see a path forward. And that's what I took away from my reading and what I'm trying for with the eggs.